going to follow the normal pattern and just start off tonight's call with a few of the updates on what's happening in the world that affects the work that we do as results to overcome global poverty and injustice. So to start off with, as Aaron mentioned last month, for those of you who were there, I'm sure many of us are following the twists and turns of the Conservative Party leadership election. Not because we can comment on results on party political matters, but of course we all know that whoever is the next Prime Minister will be in charge of the UK's international development approach broadly. Now, you may have seen in the news that the current Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, has recently halted what is being called non-essential aid spending. Because the government says it's about to breach its self-imposed spending limit of 0.5% of gross national income. And this is due to, we're told, increased humanitarian aid for Ukraine and Afghanistan. Now, I should mention that this is humanitarian aid and not military aid. So the military aid that Ukraine is getting is totally separate and doesn't count as overseas development assistance, or ODA. But nonetheless, they say we're at risk of spending beyond what they have set for international development. Now, by convention, the government isn't supposed to make big changes of policy whilst there's a leadership election. However, arguably, this is about applying their existing policy, so I think they can probably do it. But we don't know what cuts are being counted as, what's being counted as essential spending, nor do we know how this decision will actually affect people in the countries receiving this assistance over the next few months. So what we do know, if you think back, we know that the ODA budget was effectively reduced by more than they said they would, because the government counted things like COVID vaccine donations towards ODA. And so this current situation is yet more evidence, really, as far as we're concerned, that we need the ODA budget to be returned to 0.7% of gross national income, which is what it was before, and that the next Prime Minister, whoever they are, must honour the current commitment to returning to 0.7 as soon as possible. We're going to share a blog post about what this might mean in terms of further cuts, potential further cuts to international development programmes. Have been written by someone at Save the Children, and we're going to put that in the chat box. You might find that helpful to sort of see what this recent change means, but I stress that we have very little extra information. So as well as returning to 0.7, we believe that what's really important is that the amount we spend on aid is actually spent as well as it possibly can be on overcoming poverty. And that's something that we set out in our June action on the government's new international development strategy, which, as some of you will recall, has a lack of focus on poverty alleviation, much more on economic development. A very big thank you to all of you who took action on that. And although she is a leadership contender, you can still write to Liz Truss if you haven't already in her role as Foreign Secretary, and her officials will get to see your letter. So on last month's call, it doesn't feel like a whole month ago because it was actually a week later because of the national conference, but on the call, we mentioned a very significant report from Parliament's International Development Committee, published at the end of June, on racism in the aid sector. Now, the IDC, the International Development Committee, has issued challenges for everyone, NGOs, funders, governments, and even the public, to recognise the deep-rooted legacy of colonialism on the relationships between people, between nations, on the economic and financial systems that we have in the world that keep formerly colonised countries more likely to be trapped in poverty, and even the language and framing of the problems of international development that we use, that very often, unfortunately, keeps suggesting an ongoing relationship of dependency on the part of lower income countries, who clearly didn't end up poorer just by accident, but because of deliberate policies over many years based on racism and exploitation. Now, you'll have seen results address aspects of this very fundamental issue over the last couple of years, really, particularly at Results national conferences. And this year, for those of us who were with us, we were addressed by Joan Okitoy, who talked about the history of the international development sector, the origins of some of these harmful narratives, and really challenged us to think about why and how we could work towards breaking some of these stereotypes in our own campaigning. Joan's session was recorded, and you can now watch it on our website alongside recordings of some of the other sessions. We're also going to see in the chat box going to reshare links to a blog post on the IDC report, and also link to that report itself. We really do feel it was quite a fundamental challenge to our sector that the IDC issued. Now, at our conference back in June, we also heard from climate activists from around the world who had been unable to attend the climate conference, COP26, in Glasgow last year, because they weren't granted visas or weren't able to get accreditation. Whereas we know that it's vital that the people facing climate challenges themselves need to be a part of those discussions, not just the political leaders of the richest nations. Now, we've seen this kind of discrimination, unfortunately, time and again, and it's based on racist assumptions of whose voices count, who has access to travel to other countries and input into those decision-making processes. So as we've said, Results is, like many other NGOs, grappling with some of these issues, and we have a lot of work to do. Now, last month, Aaron said that we would be carrying on this conversation with you, and so that's actually the topic of this month's conference call. So as we see the conservative leadership race, a whole lot of politicians right now, we're not going to be doing that. Following on from those sessions in the National Conference, we've decided that this is a really good time to run what we are calling an active learning session. So rather than the advocacy letters or visits or media actions that we usually ask you to take, we're just going to stop and take a moment to learn and reflect, and what that format that takes is going to be entirely dependent on you. So if we're going to do justice to this important overarching topic of anti-oppression, we're calling it, and specifically anti-racism, we need to listen and to learn before taking action, and particularly from the people who suffer from that the most. This definitely is not a quick fix, but it requires that we discover or decide what our own role could be in helping to dismantle the structures, the practices and the behaviors that exist in the world, and even inside ourselves, you know, even in our own unconsciousness or our deeply held assumptions about how the world works. Now, this isn't easy at all, and no one will pretend it is. And each one of us will have different things that we want to reflect or learn about. It's uncomfortable and challenging, but we mustn't try to hide that or to shirk the responsibility of thinking about how we could try to do things differently. Now, what we're not going to do is tell anyone what they should think or how to listen, learn and act on anti-racism. But I am sure that each one of us can learn something new and find new ways of approaching our advocacy, and perhaps beyond that too, with this theme of anti-racism in mind. Now, as always, before we go to introduce our speaker, who I can see has joined us, we're going to have a very quick roundup from Ruthie with some updates around the network. So over to you, Ruthie.
Hi everyone, good to see you all here. So as Naveed mentioned, the last call was only a few weeks ago, so I don't actually have that much to say. The last call was full of updates and reflections on the National Conference and the Advocacy Day. And I think we've taken a bit of a breather since then and tried to catch up on other things. So firstly, just to thank everyone for doing the July action. I just had to remind myself what month it was, which was focused on malnutrition and asking the UK government to recommit to reaching 50 million women, children and girls with nutrition relevant programmes. So we've seen a few letters go out on that, which is great, especially given the last month's call when we heard from Jane, the nutritionist and youth leader for nutrition in Kenya, who well, for me, definitely reminded us why this is such an important topic. Also, continuing advocacy efforts on the replenishment of the Global Fund is great to see. So far, we haven't seen anything notable in the replies, but we're keeping our ears out and trying to get as much information as we can. But that'll be heating up later on this autumn, I believe, in September. So I've just lost my place, sorry. So this month, as Naveed said, it's a bit different. So whereas usually we might say, let us know if you've written a letter or forward on the letter to us. Obviously, it's a lot more down to you. It's more individual, more to your groups, but we'd still like to hear what you think about the topic, what you think about the materials, the call. So basically, just to remind that we're on the other end of the emails or the phone at any point. So if you want to reach out to share your thoughts or ask a question or ask anything that you didn't feel comfortable asking on this call, please do that, and know that we'll be here to listen and make time for that conversation. So as Naveed said, the National Conference blog is now up. So that's got all the recordings of the sessions and summaries of sessions that we didn't record. So if you were at the conference and want to watch it again, that's the place where you can go. And if you didn't manage to make it, maybe just have a look through. I'd definitely recommend trying to catch up on at least one or two of the sessions. So all really, really interesting and worth a watch. And at the National Conference, we're planning to hold elections for the new Grassroots trustee. So this is a role on the board of trustees who have a more strategic and operational involvement in results, but also are very much at the heart of everything we do. So there's a grassroots person on that board, kind of representing all of your views. And we didn't hold the election in the end, so this is just a watch this space. We'll be sending out an email clarifying what the process will be, and we're hoping that we'll be able to elect somebody into the position by the autumn so that they can carry on with, so we'll start the role by then. So we'll send out an email with more details. But in the meantime, if you're interested in the role or have any questions, again, reach out to us and we can have a chat or give you any further information. But that should be with you next week in your emails. And last month, Cheshire, we mentioned that the Cheshire group had recorded a radio advert to try and recruit new members in their local area. And we've now made it into an Instagram post so that you can all listen to it and share it. And they've also recorded another one, another great radio advert going up on their local station. So we'll be busy making that into another Instagram post at some point as well. So just a well done to Cheshire. Fingers crossed that everyone's listening and keen to get involved as a result. So that's all from me. Short and sweet, which hopefully leaves us plenty of time to discuss this month's topic.
Thanks, Ruthie. I have not talked to these people, so I'm going to put you on the spot, and feel free to not be on the spot if you don't want to. But we have Cameron on the call, who is our current Grassroots trustee. I don't know if you wanted to say anything. Please don't feel that you have to.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to say a few words. Yeah, I would just kind of encourage you. Well, firstly, if you want to know anything about what it's like to be a trustee on the board of results, then feel free to reach out to me, as well as obviously the Grassroots team as well. I know, I think I'm not speaking out of place to say that the co-chairs would also be happy to have a conversation at some point. But yeah, I would just say, so I've been on the board of results since 2020, so getting on for 2 years now. And yeah, I think, you know, it's not only it's a really great way to sort of understand how the governance of results works and sort of be in the room, and when those sort of decisions are being made around sort of strategy, but also to kind of see how just the charity sector works as well. So if it's something that interests you on you know, how charities function, then it's a really, really great opportunity to sort of get your teeth into that, and then also be the voice of the Grassroots network as well, because it's important that, you know, that we as a national network of campaigners are sort of in the room when sort of those types of decisions are made. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. If you're interested, just sort of reach out. I'm happy to have a chat.
Thanks, Cameron. That's really kind of you to say a few words. That's really helpful. We'll be, as Ruthie said, we'll send out some information next week. And I just wanted to offer quickly, if anyone from the Cheshire group wanted to talk about your radio ads. I've heard one of them and it was absolutely amazing. I think you're born actors, but I don't know if any of you wanted to just quickly say anything.
Okay. No, but thanks very much for your appreciation, Ruthie and Naveed. We've enjoyed putting them together, and we just hope that they get a lot of interest. But yeah, no, that's all there is. But thanks anyway.
Thank you. Okay, great to hear that kind of all of the news from around the network. So I'm going to now introduce our guest speaker tonight, who I can see has joined us. It's a great honour to introduce Maxine Thomas, who is a grassroots advocate with our sister organisation Results in the USA. And she is a founding member and chair of their Anti-Oppression Council. She's currently serving in her second term as one of their grassroots board members, and is also an active advocate for affordable housing in the US. Maxine, a very warm welcome.
Thank you all so much for having me. This is an honor to be invited to join your meeting and being able to share some of the work we're doing here over here in the US and just on a grassroots level. So thank you again for the invitation.
Well, as a massive thank you for joining us this evening. So let me just start by explaining to you who we've got on this call. So you're joining, it should feel familiar to you, I hope. You're joining our own grassroots volunteer campaigners from all around the UK, who regularly take campaign actions mostly aimed at the UK government to try and persuade them to prioritise international development programmes that tackle poverty and injustice, particularly around access to health and education. Some of the people on this call have been working on these issues for many years, but some of them, we also have people joining us tonight who are quite new to Results. I should mention to everyone actually that Results in the in the USA has been working very hard on anti-oppression for some years, and we really have a lot to learn from them. If you've been to one of the Results international conferences, you'll know how serious they take their anti-oppression statement, which you actually have to sign up to take part. And we're going to put this in the chat box because it really is a great manifesto for this work. So that should appear in the chat box. Now, one quite big difference between the US and the UK is that Results UK doesn't work on poverty in this country, whereas in the US they advocate on poverty both domestically and around the world. I wasn't sure if everybody knew that, so I just thought I'd mention that before we get into it. Now, I'm going to hand over to Maxine now. Maxine, we're going to be asking 3 pre-prepared questions for you, which I hope you'll have seen. But before we ask those, I'm going to ask you if you could share a little bit about yourself and how you found your way to becoming a grassroots advocate with Results and a founder member of your Anti-Oppression Council. We'd love to hear about that.
Well, thank you for asking for my story. I joined Results in 2013, the fall of 2013, and I attended my very first international conference in 2014. When I joined Results, I actually stumbled across the organization with another organization here in the US, which is called Circles, which is equipping individuals who live in poverty, who have firsthand experience, to be able to discover that they have a voice. And through that, we wanted to figure out how we could use our voice. And so there was no greater opportunity than to connect with Results, to be able to use our voices to fight the political will to end poverty through advocacy and policy work here in the US. And so upon joining Results at the international conference, I really wasn't quite aware of everything that Results does when it comes to advocating for poverty issues on a federal level. And so once I learned of the programs that was affecting me directly, as well as my community, I just took charge and continued to schedule and meet with my local legislators, our government in the United States, our senators and our US congressmen about the issues that was affecting my community directly. And from there, things just kind of took off for me with my advocacy. I also, from there, joined in 2014 at the first international conference. I was invited to come back to share my story of having firsthand experience in poverty. And then eventually I was nominated to represent our grassroots advocates on the Grassroots Board of Directors, which Results in the US have a really unique component to our board of directors, where we elect 4 grassroots board members to sit on the board of directors to be able to share and be in a liaison from our advocacy body to our board of directors. And so as mentioned, I am in my second term on the board. Through some of my advocacy and leadership in Results, I founded my own local chapter here in the state that I live in, which is in Indiana. We have a really thriving group here, where our group is a U.S. poverty focus group. So we do focus on domestic poverty work. However, we do have a global group in Indianapolis, as well. And so we partner a lot on both global and domestic issues here in my state of Indiana. Even with some of the great trainings and things that come along with results, I can say that I have had many letters to the editors that have been published. I've also had an op-ed that was published on The Hill, which is a national media platform that every member of Congress receives, talking about protecting some of the refundable tax credits for low-income families here in the United States.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's always really inspiring to hear people's personal stories, and just really an honor to hear that story, and great to hear how you're working in Indianapolis. So I'm going to go straight over to the first of our pre-arranged questions in the normal way before we open up to the floor. And when we do that, we can text in your question to me, and the number tonight to text any questions is 07906 662 571. That's 07906 662 571. And that's just in case it's more convenient for you to do that than writing in the text box, in the chat box. Or also, maybe you might not want to just ask your question directly. But before we go to that, we are going to go to our first pre-prepared question, which should be, I think, from Manchester. Is that right?
Hi, yes, it's with me.
Hi, Jess.
Hiya. The first question is, what does anti-oppression mean to you?
To me, anti-oppression is being against any forms of oppression and being a champion and standing up for being treated equally and fair. I'm sorry. Were you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, we can hear you. Carry on.
So what I was saying, the anti-oppression to me is standing up against any forms of oppression and standing up for equality and being able to be a champion and protecting individuals with just common humanity, being treated respectfully.
That's pretty simple and straightforward, isn't it? Thank you. Let's unpack that later, because there's a lot underlying this, of course. But let's move straight on to Paul. I think who we're going to ask the next question.
Yes, it's me and Paul.
Right.
Why is tackling oppression, especially racism, important in our advocacy to end poverty?
Thank you for that question. Tackling oppression, especially in racism, is definitely important because a lot of the policies and laws have been construed and built upon racist policies, and we can't end poverty unless we fight against oppression, because we want to be able to make sure that every human being has full access to adequate and equal opportunities. And so oppression is definitely something that we definitely find dear as an important piece to our advocacy, because I'm not too familiar with some of the oppression in your country. However, here in the United States, a lot of our policies have been to it's been more of a hidden form of racism to increase the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap for families of color, to not have access to certain things such as low interest rates on home ownership, having opportunities for education and ways to keep them from getting out of poverty.
Thank you, Maxine. I really, the phrase you used there really struck with me. Hidden form of racism, and yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to that. You mentioned lack of access to things like home ownership or education, and a lot of those things which are very, very practical. Maybe people don't necessarily always see that they can be linked through to racism. So I'm sure people will want to come back to that. let's move on now to the next question, which I think is coming from Kathy in Edinburgh.
Yes, I think it is as
Kathy.
well. So, hi, Maxine. I know that we are living in very different sort of historical worlds. So our sense of anti-oppression may be slightly different. But what what I'd like to do is sort of ask you, what has Results USA advocates been doing on the topic? What have you been doing as Results USA?
Wow, thank you so much for that question. There's a lot that has been done over the years around just being able to introduce our anti-oppression work. And we started with really some fundamental things internally with our staff and our board, as well as increasing it to our grassroots volunteer advocates regarding training and understanding what anti-oppression is. So there's been a lot of learnings and trainings that Results have provided to educate us across the organization about anti-oppression. And then we also connect that with our policy work that we advocate for. And so when I talk about trainings, we look at many different forms of trainings, whether it's different book clubs, finding books on anti-oppression and different topics around just issues around racism and white fragility and just different inequalities to racial wealth gap and things of that sort, as well as we have interactive conversations with our local group leaders, and we have regional coordinators who oversee the groups in their region, who provide resources. And then one thing that I will also hone in on is Results recently consulted out with a consulting group to basically have an anti-oppression consultant come in and check our organization for our anti-oppression, I would basically say like report card, just to see, you know, where we were as an organization when it comes to anti-oppressive culture, and seeing if we meet the mark on internally with like I said, with the staff, how we employ individuals within the organization, making sure we're given fair and equal opportunities for those, even with being transparent with salaries and different skills needed for positions, as well as who we are having to lead our groups, and those who basically understand that anti-oppression is really the heart of where we are now within our organization to eradicate poverty.
Well, there's a lot in there. I mean, both internally and I guess externally on the issues that you work on. And I'm sure people will love to hear a lot more about a number of those different aspects. So clearly there's, you know, a lot of people that will have very personal reasons for this important work. In being an anti-oppression campaigner, being an anti-poverty campaigner. So I think it's for all of us really to unpack that now and just see where the discussion goes really, and it is very much a discussion. So I'm going to open the floor to anybody to ask a question. So if you just feel free to just unmute yourself and go ahead. Please do introduce yourself to Maxine before you ask your question. Alternatively, there's the chat box as always, and just a reminder of that number to text in again is 07906 662 571. It's 07906 662 571, and that just means I've got to keep an eye on my phone as well, so we'll manage. So anyone want to kick off with the first question? Open the floor.
Hi, it's me.
Hi, Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, this is difficult to ask. In my understanding of the work that I've been doing and Results has been doing is that we are working on global poverty, and that global poverty is an emergent property of industrial greed, capitalism, blah, blah. I'm not going to go political here, but it's largely down to Western dominance of developing nation markets and agriculture and so on, exploitation. That's the story I've built for myself. So built into that picture, it's all about oppression. And it's never been a problem for me to actually recognize that the babies are dying because of oppression. So I'm not quite sure what's the distinction that we're addressing here in this conversation that is not that.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for sharing your kind of articulation of what poverty means to you. I'm going to throw that to Maxine to start with, but I suspect we've all got very different thoughts on that, and so this may turn into more of a discussion, and I do want people to jump in. But Maxine, your thoughts first on that question, really.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing, the question is more focused on just the oppression work with our advocacy and need that is happening across the world when it comes to greed and other stakeholders who have their hands on how they control the funding and resources that we distribute across those extreme impoverished areas. I believe that, we as an entire universe have a lot of work to do when it comes to just the golden rule as far as treating people the way you want to be treated. It's very simple. And I know that we can really talk elaborately about just the different verbiage when it comes around anti-oppression and maintaining dignity and how to wrap that into our policy work and things like that. However, what I will say is, before we can expand to doing a work on a forward-facing platform, even as grassroots advocates in the UK, I believe being receptive to how you communicate with each other, how you communicate with your parliamentarians and those abroad, to be able to push the need to be able to say that the need is there for families, especially children that are dying at an alarming rate from preventable diseases and lack of access.
Thank you for that answer.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? Because I think what we've got here is a really interesting kind of. I think, Pete, my own perspective is that I think I very much recognise the kind of analysis that you have, but that there's an extra element of, yes, that's all oppression, but actually there's very specific forms of oppression built into the systems in the world, and in particular racism. So I see Princess has got her hand up. Can I go over to you first, and we'll set up a discussion on this?
Yes. Hi, Maxine. I'm actually from Ohio, so I live here. So we're neighbors. We're state neighbors. This is the week that several of the West Indies celebrate emancipation. People of color, people from Africa, have been enslaved longer than they have been free. So I need you to think about that for a few minutes. They have been enslaved longer. Slavery started in 1500. They were enslaved up until about 1830. They have been enslaved over 300 years. They've only been free for about 180 years. The systems that enslaved them are still around today. So we're talking about the police, education. Black children in the US are penalized for wearing their hair naturally to school. They're expelled from school for wearing their hair the way it grows out of their head. So the systems that Maxine is referring to are still in place that oppresses people. And maybe it's more clear and maybe it's more dominant in the US than it is in the UK. But I guarantee if you talk to some people of color in London, they will tell you the police deals with them in a very different way than they do non-minority. So I think the systems of oppression are still present because the people who enslaved Africans built those systems. And those systems are still around today. She's talking about banks, education, police institutions, higher education. And you think of any institutions. So I think we may not always see oppression, and especially if you're not a person of color, you may not see it, but it is there. It really is still there. And I think it's nice that we write letters and we campaign for people in developing countries, but I think it's also important to campaign for people in the countries where we live, because there are still systems that oppress people in Europe, in the US definitely, and for sure in the UK.
Thanks, Princess. And that's great to really highlight that. This is a very, very broad topic, and there's the racism and oppression that exists in US and UK and in the global system that affects many of the issues that we work on as global campaigners. I don't know, Maxine, did you have any observations on what Princess has just said?
I appreciate you for even sharing and being transparent, Princess, especially your experience connecting it from living in the Midwest here in the United States, and even what's happening today. I know that we have a lot of work to do when it does come to just the racism of our work. And the thing about it is oppression, and I would say this respectfully, doesn't just stop with racist policies. There's other forms of oppression that we at Results are tackling as well, the different isms from sexism, classism, colonialism, transphobia. There's a list. And so the thing about it is, I think once we understand how we can relate to being able to be equitable in our policy work, then we will also be able to go a little more aggressive to our lawmakers about why the need is even greater to, you know, make sure that they are being champions and leading, making sure we're securing the funding that's needed for the work that we're advocating for, and ultimately being able to, again, end poverty. So it's really connected, it's intertwined, it's intergenerational. There's so many forms that we can really dive into, but just to be a resource as an organization that is advocating on poverty, these are the things that we are really speaking heavily and boldly about now, because we know that no matter how much we continue to work on every year to protect programs or to expand or to ask for someone to support and sign on to letters, we're not going to be able to push the needle further until we can really get to the root. And the root is the forms of oppression and racism.
Thanks for that powerful reminder, Maxine. I'm going to go to the next question, which is coming on text. Now, I hope I'm understanding this right. This is from Tejal in Oxford. Hi, Tejal. So the question that's been texted to me is, domestically and internationally, what are the strongest parallels that Results USA sees that we can highlight via advocacy? So, for example, how grassroots activity in Indiana influenced shifts to, say, access to medical aid, and highlighting the disproportionate deaths of mother and children in certain communities. I hope I've made that question make sense. If not, Tejal, you might have to chip in.
Could you ask it again, please?
I'll try. I think this is the question. So really the parallels that you're seeing in Results in the USA that we can highlight. So I'm seeing this question as kind of about the things that you're doing with domestic poverty in Indiana, and what are the things that might be in common with stuff that we see in other places around access to medical support, infant deaths, that kind of thing in other parts of the world. Is that something that you can speak to, Maxine?
Maxine's she had to drop off the call. There were some connection issues. She was calling in the middle of a work thing. So she's literally just sent me a message to apologize a lot. She sent her email address and will happily answer any questions over email, and was really pleased to join us all, but she just couldn't work around this sudden disruption.
Okay.
But there's quite a lot of questions in there and discussions that we've had that I think we can share amongst each other, and what we think about some of these questions.
Okay, let's do that then. Let's go with the flow. It was a shame to lose our speaker, but thank you for letting us know. So I'm guessing this kind of arises from the thing that Pete raised earlier around, you know, the global issues that we're talking about and how that fits with some of the more domestic aspects of lack of access to these same services in the UK or the US. Does anyone want to sort of say anything about that? I see, William, you've got your hand up. Is that coming in on this point? You're on mute, William. William, we can't hear you. There we go.
Yes, it's something similar, but we're talking from two countries that have long pasts, and I'm just wondering whether there are any model newer countries who are leading the way, and we should follow their example. I mean, Sweden is held out for good education. There are other things we can learn from them, and we know that Norway is very generous in their contributions to development. Are they a good example? Can we get away from US and UK and find flagships or leaders in sort of new outlooks?
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of ways of taking that thought. Does anyone want to respond to that? I don't want to be the one who always responds as chair, so I'm going to open that to the floor to respond to William's thought.
I was just going to say, in terms of the Scandinavian countries, they are really good at socialism and ensuring equality for everyone. But I have some friends in Sweden, and I've visited them quite a bit. And one thing I know about their country is the tax is about 40%. So we always talk about that. And I even have this discussion with my husband. Would other countries be willing to pay that much tax to accommodate everybody and to have all the things that they have? And I think sometimes some of our countries will probably not be willing to accommodate a 40% tax. But I know in Sweden, they have more women in parliament than any other country. They're really good in terms of equality for gender rights and different abilities. And they've long been at the forefront of equity and equality for everybody, including people of color, but they do pay their fair share individually. So, you know, that is sometimes a trade-off. And I'm not sure if people in the UK or in the US would be willing to give 40% of their pound or dollar up for the greater good.
Thanks, Princess. I think I'm going to follow up, move over to something that's coming in the text. Now, I'm not going to ignore people who've previously put things in the chat box, but I've just noticed this is directly relevant from Ricky and Karen in Cheshire. Is there a danger we only look to white countries, white in inverted commas, for providing aid and solving problems? Some African countries did really innovative things with regard to COVID. Can we learn from the global south? That really speaks to me. I think one of the things that we're often talking about in results is partnerships, and sort of more equal partnerships and working together does seem to be quite an important aspect of moving on, rather than looking to a particular country or group to do things for others on their own, regardless of the history. But I wondered if someone wanted to elaborate in that thought, whether in the Cheshire group or anyone else.
Kathy has her hand up.
Oh, hi, Kathy. I didn't see you there. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I think that it's a really relevant point that it's not, I mean, if you start from the basis of wanting much more global equality, rather than looking at whether it's rich countries providing aid to poor countries, if you start from a basis of the fundamental is about making a more equal world, then some of the issues would definitely start from looking at what have countries done well around the world for the whole of their population, and how they have shown anti-oppressive. And I think, I mean, South Africa has got a lot of good things that it did as an example of how it did overcome apartheid. And those are the sorts of things that we can, they may have not succeeded as well as we might have hoped. But I do think that if we look at it in a different perspective, it's not about white countries or rich countries, but about how we can all be a lot more equal.
100% agree with that. I saw, Kathy, that you had in the question in the chat a question about results in the USA thinking about anti-oppression at the global level compared with the national level, but without our speaker, I'm not sure we can follow that one up. But so we can maybe come back to that if that's something that anyone has any thoughts on. But it does seem to link potentially to the question that Jill put in the chat box, and which I'm also assuming was aimed at our speaker. But I'm guessing a lot of us have got some ideas about this, which is, could we think a little bit more about climate change and how colonial attitudes have a bearing on that? I suspect lots of people have got something to say about that, but does anyone want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, I'll go.
Pete.
Yeah, well, climate change is essentially inevitable, and it's going to affect the poorest first. It already is, and it's going to put incredible pressure on the developed world, because more and more people are going to want to come to safer places where there's food, where there's an opportunity. And it almost seems to me like that the actual bottom line aim of ending poverty might have to change, because climate change is actually the biggest threat that we face. Oppression and racism, it's everywhere. I mean, even if you go to some of the developing countries, you'll find racism and oppression among the poor. It's a human emergent property. It's what we do to each other. But if we really, really want to engage in ending poverty, I think we're up against climate change now more than anything else. That's my...
Thanks, Pete. One of the things that occurs to me, having sort of campaigned on climate change on and off over a number of years, is that we often hear that the countries that have benefited most from industrialization, and that's off the back of colonialism, are the ones that have done most to cause climate change. Exactly. And the ones that are suffering the most have done the least. Yes. Which is something that I think is a very stark fact.
Yeah, but we're talking about justice, which is different to action. I'm going from the basis that the whole thing is really unfair. I mean, poverty, climate, what you've just said, it's all terribly unfair, and it is what we've got. And in order to fight against that and to change that, it's more than just about complaining that Whitey's done this, or the Muslims have done that, or the Buddhists are doing this. It's really a global issue, and we have to take it from the fact that it's human nature, and we're actually really fighting human nature most of the time.
I don't think it's that the people who are affected by climate change will want to come to the developed country. I think most people want to stay where they are. They like the culture. They are near the language. Even during the Syrian crisis, they were only trying to get away temporarily. They wanted to go back to their country. But the issue with the climate change is their country will disappear. Cape Verde will probably disappear. A lot of the South Polynesian islands will disappear. A lot of the Caribbean islands. So I think it's not just that they are going to want to leave and come to, G8 countries. Their country will disappear, as Naveed said, primarily because of these G8 countries who are not doing enough, and they're causing a lot of the climate problems.
Yep.
Thank you, Princess.
I agree.
I see Tyra's got her hand up. Tyra, go ahead. You're on mute, Tyra.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to what Princess said, which is and add a piece about how white racism is absolutely integral into what's happening with the climate emergency. That the global North has exploited the global South, and that there is a race element in that. And as Princess said, it's the poor that are going to suffer the most. But we do need to, they're all absolutely entangled. We can't end the climate crisis without doing something about oppressions, and racism is a big one of those, and vice versa.
That word entanglement really speaks to me. The fact that, you know, we've been trying to work out. So Ruthie and I were putting together some of the action materials that we posted out to you this week, and we really thought hard about how to try and express these things all working together. Not that we're suddenly doing something new that we weren't doing before, that we're articulating different aspects of this very interconnected problem in a way that was maybe focusing a little bit more on the injustice side rather than just the material poverty, and specifically those injustices that are around that either obviously racialized or that there's a race component that isn't being spoken about at the moment. And so that's the kind of, if you like, the kind of things that we're trying to grapple with at Results. I noticed that we've got, where is it in the chat? Harriet, really good point. Asking a question about our role in public education as Results, particularly in the use of words or language, given that obviously our letter writing is based on words. And Harriet's noted that we're not using the term aid so much, and that is definitely true of my writing. And we can talk about that, but rather than just give you our reasons for that, I wondered if anyone wanted to. Harriet, did you want to come in on that, or does anyone else want to talk about the language that we use?
Well, it was just a point that, as I say, you know, with a lot of our opinions come out in our language, in the language we use, and there's a fair amount of pushback that occurs to do with political correctness have gone mad and all that. So I just wondered whether, you know, Results does have an important role that we could play in encouraging public education on the use of words that work and words that don't work, because it's changing and people get very confused.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. And, you know, we do address this in our action materials, only in a very, I mean, it's 3 or 4 sides of paper. So, you know, it can't possibly do justice to the topic, but there are some links and resources to enable this conversation to really carry on in your groups. So this learning that we hope you'll be able to make time for or want to make time for this month. So just to answer that particular point, one of the problems with the word aid, I mean, we all use it and it's not a wrong word. There are times when it will be the appropriate word and it's something that people understand, but it does foster this sense of that we're giving to other people and they're the beneficiaries and they should be grateful in some way. Now, that's not probably the way that we think of it on this call, but some people will. And whilst we are, you know, giving that assistance, other people will see it as, actually, that's more reparations for the historical wrongs that have been done to countries and being done to countries where the majority of the population are black-skinned. You know, that there's other ways of looking at that. And so more perhaps different ways we're still thinking about things like, we're talking about ODA now, official development assistance. I'm definitely, whether I'm right or wrong, I'm definitely using that term more. I don't like acronyms and jargon, but it does take that element of dependency out of our language. That's not necessarily the right way that you will find, you know, you'll probably find your own way to describe what our official development assistance and what our international development work in the UK is doing. You may choose to carry on using the word aid, and, you know, many people understand it and it's something that is seen on television. So I think that's a really good sort of subtopic that some of you might want to go away and explore in this month's learning moment, as we're calling it. we've got a couple of minutes, but I do want to get to one question that it's been up on the chat for a long time from Alexander, who's asking about some notable examples of domestic/international aid policies or programs put forward by Western governments or NGOs that did nothing to benefit poor people of colour that we should know about.
Yeah, good.
I bet there's some examples. Pete, go ahead.
No, it's good. That's a good question.
I can think of an example.
Go on.
Ruthie, you looking like you want to say something.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and try quickly, in not much time, link that with how the problem with the word aid and kind of the helplessness narrative that goes along with that is that sometimes so in the international development sector, who is seen as an expert is maybe a white person in Geneva who works for an organization, or somebody in an office in Washington who's had their education in a very middle class white environment, for example. And if they're seen as an expert, and you have this idea that then the person who is actually being affected by the issue doesn't actually know how to solve it, you can get clashes that can come about from culture or understanding. So one example, this is very anecdotal, but in Laos, in a small village, I remember talking to someone who said, we don't use Western toilets because that's not culturally what we use, but this charity came in and insisted on building these toilets because that's what they thought was best. They hadn't started by asking what the people actually needed or wanted. They approached it as, I'm an expert, I know what's best, built it. And she said they were never used. They were a danger because children weren't familiar and didn't want to use these new newly tiled places. So I think that's on a very small level, but that sort of mentality of who's an expert and whose voice is valued the most actually comes from a place of that often racialized expert, not expert. And if you're poor and in a situation, you may well know it.
So yeah, thank you for answering my question. So essentially, the experts that these NGOs look up to or get their ideas from about how to help these poor countries, they look to people who aren't familiar with the country's culture, and essentially that can cause problems when they implement their policies, when they try to help, when they aim to help people, but they do things wrong because of the difference of culture.
Yeah,
I think
not
that's
all
right.
The time. I would say definitely not all the time. And this is what was highlighted in the International Development Committee report, was that moving towards true partnerships where you're sharing the power, and it's not just that one person or one organization has the power to dictate, or that's probably not, but say what's happening without asking. That's kind of the move that we're seeing now, which is quite a big thing going on among our colleagues in different organizations and across the world, that how can you have more of equal partnership decision making that's going to benefit everyone in a better way. So it's not all like doom and gloom. There's definitely those movements, but I think the thing around who is, when is something valued and really acted upon. So I read an article that in 2017 a Nigerian doctor flagged monkeypox, and now the West, like the UK and the US, is only acting on monkeypox and the vaccine because it's reached people within the border of that country, whereas it had been flagged by a Nigerian doctor in 2017. So you get some cases like that, which questions of.
That's not racism.
That is an example.
That's not racism. That's economics.
I think there is an underlying issue of who's listened to, which is a structural. You could argue there's a structural element to racism in there, which is rooted in the colonial power structures. But I think what this conversation for me, and I'm going to use my chair's prerogative actually to wind up because we've gone over by 3 minutes already, is that this is a really multifaceted and wide-ranging a set of conversations. It's not even one conversation, ranging from this point we're on now around power relationships and who listens to who, through to what extent is overt racism in underlying that historically and actually today, right through to clear examples of egregious racism in our own countries and even in organizations. So what we've tried to do is create a set of materials and some resources that allow you to go to the bit of that you're most drawn to thinking about, whether it's language, whether it's colonialism. And so, yeah, I'm sorry to cut this off. I really am. I can see some great contributions coming in. I've had both on text and in the chat. But we'll kind of put as much as we can in the description when we put the recording online. Sadly, our speaker had to leave us early. I will be thanking her, of course, as you'll expect me to. But thank you to all of you. The conversation did not stop just because she had to leave. And just, yeah, thank you for being with us this evening and sharing this, really quite complex and sensitive range of topics. And I'm sure this isn't, this is just the start of a whole range of conversations. And we really want to hear from you. We definitely don't have the right answers. So please do think about using some of the resources in this month's action sheet. I can see that Ruthie's just put Maxine's email address. Should you want to ask her anything directly, please feel free. I'm sure she won't mind. Whether you undertake that learning as an individual, with friends and family, or in your results group, that's entirely up to you. As I said at the beginning, we don't have the right answers. We aren't trying to tell people what to think. We're trying to help. We're trying to unpick this set of questions for ourselves and see what we think about. We're all going to be different. So just before we close, we're going to put 2 more links in the chat. And if you don't get around to clicking on them, don't worry. As I say, we'll share them again. We're going to put a link to our anti-oppression page on our results website, which gives you a few, some of the things that we've been doing internally on this, alongside some of the things we've discussed. And there'll also be a link to the action materials, which you have already been sent on email. But if any of this you don't get through, just pick up the phone to us, drop us an email, and we'll share any of those resources separately. So sorry we've overrun. It was some really important conversations that I didn't really feel comfortable closing down any quicker than I did. Goodbye for now. I look forward to seeing you again at the next Grassroots conference call, which will be Tuesday, the 6th of September, and once again at the usual time of 8 p.m. We think, unless we get a speaker and an exciting speaker in a different time zone, but assume it'll be 8 p.m. So that's all for now. Really great to have this conversation with you all, and please do enjoy the rest of your evenings.